The Chinese University of Hong Kong Library contains a small but important collection of Western rare books, defined as books printed before 1900. Of the over 2,400 books, the earliest of which dates to 1479, we have important strengths in the histories of architecture, medicine, and Western books about China, including Chinese medicine. Here are some of the books we're going to look at today. As you can see, they range in size and in format and include some wonderful early modern maps, including of China. These books were printed between the late 15th century and the end of the 18th century in places like London, Paris, and Venice. And it's going to be a real pleasure to introduce you to them today. Let's make a start, shall we? We begin with the only manuscript that we're going to be looking at today, a 15th century Book of Hours produced in France for either an elite woman or an elite man to recite prayers from or to follow the Holy Office. You see, first of all, the binding. The binding, although probably not original, is still early modern, and you notice the wooden main part and then paper added on the inside. The manuscript itself is written in a fine Gothic script, typical of the late Middle Ages, and features additional text in red or rubrication. This was normally used for chapter headings or for significant words, which were added later in red. You also see these elaborate initial letters. This is a letter D, for the beginning of Domine, O Lord. It is not only decorated with color, but is also gilded. That is to say, there's a layer of gold leaf, real gold leaf, added to the manuscript to add to the decoration. On the left, we also see one of the images in this manuscript, a representation of the Mass, to remind the reader, even in their moment of solitary contemplation, of that particular sacrament. Here we also see a beautiful leaf decoration around the edges, which is typical of late medieval manuscripts. Leafing through the text, we see that the rubrication, that is to say the text in red, continues for titles and important words, and we also see that the gilding for initials also continues throughout the manuscript. In other words, this was a highly labor-intensive product produced by multiple people over several days, weeks, or maybe even months. Further through the manuscript, we also see some interesting paragraph endings, which are similarly gilded and in color. This continues throughout the manuscript, which finishes with the word Amen. Our first printed book is a 1479 edition of the Summa Theologica of St. Antoninus, printed in 1479. Opening it, we see various features recognizable from the world of manuscript. We see, for instance, the Gothic typeface. This book was produced by a famous German printer named Jensen, who worked in Venice, and who developed a number of very influential typefaces that went on to influence the modern fonts and book typefaces we know today. This included Times New Roman, but here we see an example of his workaday Gothic typeface. The text itself is in 2 columns, typical of theological manuscripts. This is a work on theology. And then to it was added rubrication, letters, underlinings, and various features in red. And then this illuminated initial with gilding and also fleur-de-lis decoration. We can see on the left here a little note left by the printer for the artist. You see that small letter D? Well, that was a note to add this colorful large letter D, which is the first letter of this Latin word dum, while. Probably the printer expected the illustrator to cover this, maybe with gilding or maybe with color. But for some reason he hasn't, and so we can see that little letter D that the printer left. Leafing through the book, we see this first section, Tabula Huius Operis, or Table of Contents, which explains what is in each titulus, or section. We can also see these various chapter headings, which are at the top of every page and tell you where you are in the book. You'll also see that the rubrication continues, although the gilding doesn't. Our next book is another work by St. Antoninus of Florence, this time a collection of sermons. The first thing you'll notice about this book is the binding. Although not original, this is an example of an early modern book binding. You see it has a wooden base with leather layered on it, and on the inside there is paper, or you see the scraps of it anyway. Frequently, spare or unwanted paper was used in the bindings of books. And therefore, if we dig into old book bindings, we often find whole texts that have been discarded. And from time to time, even unknown classical texts or interesting poems and doodles are found in the bindings of early modern books. This was printed in 1483, so again during the earliest period of printing before 1501, and so can be classified as an incunable. Again, we see the familiar features of the world of manuscript. We see the Gothic script, we see the columns, typical of theological texts, and we see the different stages of production, starting with the black printed text and then moving onto the comparatively light rubrication that we see in this particular book. We also see another feature of the world of manuscripts, what is called an incipit or incipit. That is to say, an initial statement of what the text is, ending with the word incipit or incipit. That is to say, it begins. We also have clues about who owned this manuscript. We have the name of one particular owner scribbled here at the bottom. George Ketterney. Leafing through, we also see examples of usage in the form of these marginal notes added by a particular reader who was evidently interested in quotations from the Bible that were mentioned in this work of St. Antoninus. Finally, going to the end of the book, we see an exciting new feature of the world of print. That is to say, extensive indices, sections at the back of the book where you could find out where particular things of interest were mentioned and what pages they were mentioned on. If, for example, you wanted to know about studying and prayer, you knew which page to turn to. Our next book is the first title from our collection of Western medical books. In this case, a work by the ancient physician Celsus, who lived under the emperors Augustus and Tiberius. This work was lost in the Middle Ages and rediscovered in the 15th century, when it was widely printed and very popular among both physicians and scholars for its useful information on diet and exercise, as well as common illnesses, and for its beautiful Latin style. This particular edition was printed in Venice in 1493. Venice, if you remember, being a great center for the publishing of humanist and classical works. With this book, you'll notice that it's printed in a different typeface. Here we see what is frequently called the italic typeface, a type of writing that was reinvented in the 15th century on the basis of Carolingian, that is to say 9th century manuscripts, although the people in the 15th century thought it was in fact Roman handwriting that they were reviving. You'll see here that it follows the style of modern typefaces and fonts like Times New Roman, and in fact many of the fonts that you use today on your computer were actually first developed in 15th and 16th century Venice. Looking at the form of the manuscript, you'll recognize many features, including the space left for an initial that was, however, never added. The person who produced the text, however, left a note so that the artist later knew which letter to add, in this case a U or V. Another interesting feature of this particular book is the evidence of use. Clearly, somebody, either in Venice or elsewhere in the early modern period, was very interested in the contents of this book, and so made various marginal annotations, as well as underlining particularly important passages. This annotation continues throughout large parts of the book, although, as in many cases, it tails off towards the end, because in the past, as today, people read the beginnings of books more intensively than the latter parts of books. You'll see other features of the world of print, including these chapter headings at the top of each page. This is the second part. This is the fifth part. And you also see an innovation in the form of printed page numbers at the top, and then at the bottom, letters which represent the foliation, so that later, once the pages had been printed and it was time to bind them together, the binders knew the order of the individual parts of the quires, as they're called. Leafing to the end, we see again a index. If you have a toothache, you know that you have to turn to page XL1, in other words, to page 41. If you have a sore stomach, you go to folio 1. Our next book is a very important text, namely the Christian Bible, printed in Venice in 1492 in an octavo format, that is to say, in a smaller pocket form that could be carried around and could be bought somewhat more cheaply than the larger quarto and folio formats. Opening the book, you see that it begins with a series of indices in alphabetical order by Bible story. So if you wanted to find a particular story or were interested in a particular virtue, such as charity, you could find out where to look in the Bible. Again, you see a Gothic typeface and rubrication. And various prefatory material. A prologus in Bibliam, an introduction to the Bible, with rather basic illumination. And then you have the beginning of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. Here, with that medieval manuscript form, Incipit or Incipit, it begins the book of Genesis. In principio creavit Deus caelum et terram. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. You'll also note various things that were not written in, but were already printed in the margins. References to other parts of the Bible or to commentaries on the Bible. These sort of paratextual features would become increasingly common in the age of print, as scholars and general readers wanted more information about the text. Our next book was printed in Cologne in Germany in 1613 and features a new and exciting development in the history of print, an elaborate title page which gives the title of the work, information about the author, the process of editing, and the dedication, and finally the place and date of printing. Can you make out the date? MDCX111, or 1613 in Roman numerals. This particular work in question is a commentary on the Book of Moses by a 1st century Jewish philosopher named Philo of Alexandria. And it's a bilingual text in Greek and Latin. You see the Greek here in capitals, and then the Byzantine minuscule that was developed in Venice in the late 15th century. And then you see the typical italic humanist script. You'll see on the title page elaborate classicizing decoration. By classicizing, I mean in the style of ancient Greece and Rome as revived in the Renaissance. You see here what are effectively Corinthian columns, and you see images of men and deities in a typical style reminiscent of classical statues. Indeed, architecture heavily influenced title pages and their design. We see similar examples of engraving throughout the book, which, as you'll notice, has replaced illumination and rubrication. You see here an elaborate initial S, which does not or did not have to be decorated by a separate artist, because it came already decorated when it was printed. Again, you see the paratextual features, these marginal notes that give references to other texts and to other parts of the text. And then you see an index, both in Greek and in Latin. And going to the text itself, you see that the Greek is on the left and the Latin on the right. With page numbers and chapter headings, as well as those folio or quire markers at the bottom. Sometimes with bilingual texts, it wasn't possible to fit all of the text into one column, as just like when translating between Chinese and English, sometimes one language requires more or fewer words. Therefore, sometimes the columns had to bleed into the next column. As you see here, the Greek making its way into the Latin column because it took more words to say the same thing in Greek. Our next book comes from the part of the collection devoted to the history of architecture. We see here the larger format, generally called folio. That is to say, it's a more expensive book, perhaps designed to be kept in a library and used more occasionally than the smaller octavo pocketbook size. In this case, this is Vincenzo Scamozzi's Treatise on Architecture, printed in Venice in 1615. Suitably as a treatise on architecture, the title page is highly influenced by the neoclassical Renaissance style of architecture. Here we see a building which frames the picture of the author and information about him and the book itself, with Corinthian columns, that most ornate of the classical orders of columns, and a classical portico, a classical temple design, as well as various classical style statues. There's also an interesting inscription in Latin at the top. Nemo huc liberalium artium expers ingrediatur. No one may enter into this place without knowledge of the liberal arts. A nice inscription for a school, perhaps. We also see here information about where it was printed and the date, and other small pointers to what is important in architecture. On the left, we have theory, and on the right, we have experience. Architecture being a mixture of these two things, of theory and of experience, as a practical art. Leafing through the book, it opens, typically of later early modern books, with a dedication, in this case to a prince, perhaps because the prince funded its printing, or perhaps because the printer or author wished to curry favor with the prince, to develop a good relationship with him for some reason, maybe for future financial gain or patronage. Again, we have an index at the beginning, arranged here by chapter, and then we have the text itself, beginning with the introduction or proemio of the first book. You'll see here various marginal features. You'll see references on the right, and you'll see paragraph numbers on the left. These were increasingly added to texts for ease of finding and citation. You'll also see in this book various tables. These increasingly became features of technical works on architecture, geometry, and mathematics. And printers developed considerable skill in making tables and diagrams, which were then useful for the development of these various scientific and mathematical disciplines. You'll also see a variety of different types being used depending on the text in question. You'll see that the main text is in an upright italic, similar to Times New Roman, and then you'll see other parts of the text in what we today would call italics, in a side-sloping script. In this case, the side-sloping script is used for quotations from classical authors. In this case, a couplet, a Latin poetical couplet. And in this case, a quotation from the Bible. We now move on to a highly specialized and technical segment of the world of printing, the printing of maps. Here we have the wonderful 1626 map of the Kingdom of China by England's leading map maker, John Speed. Looking at the map, you see, in fact, it includes much more than China. In addition, you see Japan, almost recognizable to us today, and the Korean peninsula, which at the time they thought was not quite connected to continental East Asia. We also see India with its famous river, the Ganges, and of course the Indus as well. This map is typical of these ornate, set-piece early modern maps. Not only do we have a considerable amount of detail, we have cities such as Macau, we have provinces, this is Canton or Guangdong, but we also have additional features and notes, such as this representation of the Great Wall that was known to Europeans at the time. In addition, the map includes various ethnographic or contextual information. Round the edges, for instance, you see images of people who lived in the area represented on the map. You see, for instance, someone from Pegu in Southeast Asia, a representation of somebody from China, a soldier from Japan, and a woman from China. At the top, we also see various cities, including Macau, which, as you can see, in the early modern period, was connected to the mainland by a thin strip of land. We also see, at the top right, a representation of the Japanese martyrs. The famous instance in the early 17th century when large numbers of Christians were killed, in fact crucified, by the new Tokugawa authorities. We also see various other decorations, including ships from the time. That looks like a Spanish-style galleon and an East Asian-style sampan, and mythological beasts, which were added for purely aesthetic reasons. This is, however, not to say that the map was fictional or made up in any way. This was a highly technical piece of work, which you can gather from this scale here in the legend. Okay? Although this is not as accurate a map as we might be able to produce today, this was an attempt to create an accurate, technically competent representation of the world that would give significant information to the viewer. The next book comes from the section of the collection devoted to East-West relations, and is also notable because of its small size, 16th or even 24th the size of a folio. This really was a pocket book for the smallest of pockets. Here we have the beautiful and intricate title page, which tells us that this is a description of the Kingdom of China, printed in Leiden in 1639. It also includes a number of very interesting features related to early modern European understandings of China. It includes, for instance, a copy of the famous Ricci-Ruggeri map of China, although not the most detailed one, and attempts to write Chinese characters, although not particularly successful ones, it seems, and the representation of a chop. Leafing delicately through this tiny book, we see that there is again a dedication to a patron, an address to the reader from the printer, and then a table of contents. The book itself is a translation into Latin by Nicolas Trigault of Matteo Ricci's diary from his time in China. In other words, this is one of the most important sources for East-West interactions, since it was written by the most famous early Jesuit missionary, Matteo Ricci, and who was the first to enter, the first missionary, and indeed Westerner for quite some time, to enter Beijing. Another feature you'll note is the gilding on the edge of the pages. This was a common feature of more expensive and ornate early modern books, and certainly makes the book very attractive. Turning to the end, even though it's a tiny book, it still has an index. In case you're interested in, say, the buildings of Ming China, you can turn to page 29. If you're interested in the emperor's wives and concubines, Zip, in Cantonese, I believe, you can turn to page 187. We continue with the part of the collection dedicated to the history of medicine, and particular Asian medicine. This tiny pocketbook contains two works, one by the Portuguese physician Garcia de Horta, and the other by a Dutch physician, Bontius. This was printed in Leiden in 1642, but belonged to the Jesuit college in Paris, at least at one point, as we can see from this ownership note at the bottom. The Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, was disbanded and expelled in the late 18th century, and so perhaps we can imagine that this book entered the market in a large sale of the goods of that college in perhaps the 1770s. Looking at the title page, you see various representations of medicine and of Asia. You see, for instance, what looks like an ancient Greek doctor with a staff and a serpent circling the staff. That is a typical Western iconographic device to represent medicine. And then we have somebody with feathers on their heads, representing Asia, as well as this mythological beast, underlining the fact that this is a very exotic book from the Western perspective. The title is included here, about Eastern medicine, De Medicina Indorum, and then the subsections. The book itself begins with a dedication, in this case from Bontius to his dear brother, Fratri Suo Carissimo, who also held a position in the administration of the city of Leiden. In this case, the book also includes various comments made by other authors that were printed at the beginning, and then the work goes into the various sections which are devoted to different sorts of medicines that were popular in Asia at the time. We have here, for instance, a section on sandalwood and its medicinal properties. And the special qualities of a particular plant called the Arbor Tristis, the sad tree, which apparently grew in India. This final section here was perhaps useful to Europeans going to Asia for the first time. It's a section on dysentery. Indeed, the mortality rate of Jesuit missionaries traveling from Europe to India in the 16th century was 50%. Due to differences in climate, diet, and I suppose the biological landscape, Europeans frequently suffered from dysentery and died on their first trip to India, and therefore this section would have been particularly useful. We continue with the history of architecture and find ourselves in front of this very interesting 17th century collection of prints which served as examples for other artists to copy. This is the 1642 edition of the Officina Arcularia, a rather rare work which contains these quite wonderful, I think, prints of architectural features, decorative features that you might want to include in a building or a church, taken, as the title page suggests, from various authors, so collected from different places. You'll also notice here on the title page that it's meant for an international audience. We have the title first in Latin, then in French, then in German, and then in Dutch. Let's look at some of the architectural features that they suggest. Well, here we have something quite interesting. This is a table, or maybe even an altarpiece, an altar. And we have some technical elements to this drawing as well. You see some proportions, right, being measured out. Here we have a frame, perhaps, as the image suggests, for shelves, but it could also contain a painting or maybe even a statue. Here we have some very ornate decoration that might form part of a tomb or maybe the external decoration of a building. And here, this might go at the top of any building or any room. And you see here that this was produced during the Renaissance with its highly classicizing forms, both in terms of the representation of the people and the mythical animals. This is a centaur, and in terms of this sort of architectural feature here. Here we have one of the crown jewels of our collection relating to Western perceptions of China. This is Martino Martini's 1667 Novus Atlas Sinensis, or his new Atlas of China, with its wonderful maps and illustrations by an artist called Blau. Here we have its wonderful colored title page, with the title here in the form of a tablet gateway opening up to allow these small cherubs to bring a globe and a map of China. And you can see that they have various instruments for mapping that they're using. We also see at the top a reference to the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. This is their emblem up here, Jes, as in Jesus, the Society of Jesus, as Martini was a Jesuit missionary in China. He also was an author of important other works, including a history of the Manchu conquest of China, De Bello contra Tartaros. A final interesting feature is this mark of ownership we see at the top, which tells us that this belonged to a Jesuit institution in Germany. Let's open the book, shall we? Like most of the books we've looked at, it opens with a dedication. Here you see the typeface is huge. This is the first Western Atlas of China and is on a scale suitable for atlases. That is to say, suitable for including large maps. Here we have the first map, a complete map of China, which is accompanied by 15 provincial maps. You see already on this map we have the various provinces subdivided with these colored lines, and the map also extends west across Southeast Asia and into India. Here we have Bengal. On the right, we also see Japan and a relatively accurate depiction of the Korean peninsula. Formosa, the old name for Taiwan, and Hainan, there. Moving forward, Here we have the provincial map of Guangdong. Here, the city of Macau is noted. Canton, Guangzhou, and various other smaller cities, mountain ranges, and other geographical features. You notice that this is a technical drawing in a sense. You see the scale on the bottom, which is given in both what they're calling Chinese stadia, Chinese miles, and also German military miles as well. Turning to the end of the book, we have one of the most important features of this atlas from the perspective of the history of cartography. Here is the catalogue of geographical locations of individual cities in China. This is the pre-modern equivalent of GPS, with each city having its own longitude and latitude. Here, for instance, we see Macau. We continue with Western books on China, with a very important volume by Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit polymath and supposedly the last man to know everything. This is his China Illustrata, his illustrated book about China, which has some really wonderful engravings in it. Here we have one of the opening, I guess, a pre-title page, which has on the left the missionary Adam Schall, and on the right the missionary Matteo Ricci. In the center of the image, we have a reference to the Society of Jesus with their monogram, Jes for Jesus. And here we have the famous Ricci-Ruggeri map of China. Here we have the true title page, which tells us that it was printed in Amsterdam in 1667. This encyclopedia of all Western knowledge about China contains information about language, culture, dress, geography, and many other topics. It also contains some wonderful images, including this image. This is an image of a famous tablet, which was rediscovered in 1625, which relates to the Nestorian Christians, with text in Syriac as well as Chinese, and which was used in Western attempts to understand the Chinese characters, as well as to justify the Christian missions by pointing out that Christianity had a long history in China. We also find some very interesting and famous images, including here of the missionary Adam Schall, after whom Adam Schall House, the dormitory in United College, is named. You see him here in his role as imperial astronomer. And here you see the very famous image of Ricci and one of his Chinese collaborators. Ricci, you see, is dressed in Chinese dress. He took on the dress of a mandarin, a scholar official, in his attempts to spread Christianity. And you also see here various Western attempts to write Chinese characters, some more effective than others. We continue with our books on Western medicine with this small volume devoted to the medical terminology of Sri Lanka, written by a Huguenot French scholar called Della. This was printed in Amsterdam in 1679 in this very small format, this pocket format, meant perhaps for a peripatetic physician of some sort. We also see a tiny ownership mark here. The book itself is printed in an italic typeface, typical of the period, with a dedication at the beginning, an index of all the different medicines and plants mentioned in the text, and then subsections on different sorts of medicines and plants that you might find in Sri Lanka and their various uses. We continue with the history of medicine and Western interest in Chinese medicine. This is an important translation of a Chinese medical text by the Jesuit missionary from Poland, Boym, entitled Specimen Medicinae Sinensis, which means an example of Chinese medicine, printed in Frankfurt in 1682. This book, as the title page explains, discusses Chinese ideas about the pulse, as well as European ideas about the pulse, and then the different pressure points used in Chinese medicine. This is a highly erudite and technical work, which would have been read by physicians and professors of medicine in Europe. It also contains, as well as the Latin translation, technical terminology in Chinese in an early form of pinyin. Of most interest to us, however, today are the engravings, which were clearly based on the original Chinese text. Looking at the two images, you see that the original Chinese text contains many more descriptions, whereas the Western text illustrates the different parts of the body more clearly and only notes different organs. Here, for instance, it notes the lungs, the pulmones, the stomach, stomachus, and so forth. Here we see the Western and Chinese versions of the different pressure points. Again, you can see the Chinese original is highly annotated with the technical names of these different pressure points, whereas the Western image is much more pared down, a sign that in the process of translation, some things were lost. It also includes a very famous image of the heart. And another image with Chinese terms here written in this early version of Pinyin. Here we have one of the most important books in the history of Western sinology. The first major translation of Chinese classics, in this case, the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean and the Analects, translated as Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, Confucius the Philosopher of the Chinese, printed in Paris in 1687. This was a combined translation effort by various Jesuit missionaries in China and continued to cast a long shadow into the 18th and 19th century as one of the earliest translations. It's this work that to a large extent also gives us the English name Confucius, which is of course a Latin word. Of most interest to us is perhaps this wonderful image at the beginning of the biography of Confucius here, Confucii Vita, his biography. Here, there's a brief description of Confucius's life, where he was born, his family situation, as well as various Chinese characters. And the translation is, in a sense, not too bad. Here for CUHK, they have Gymnasium, which means university or school, and here for Guo, they have Imperii, which means empire. So it's not a terrible translation, I suppose. Another interesting feature of this book is the chronological list of emperors, which is the first Western attempt to create a chronology for Chinese history. This was based on the close reading of various Chinese historical texts and also notes important events that happened in the lives of each of the emperors, as well as noting the Christian date, which might be associated with the beginnings of their reign. We continue with the history of medicine, but now find ourselves in the 18th century, and rather than in continental Europe, in Britain, with a treatise on scurvy, the title says, in 3 parts, printed in London in 1757. Scurvy, as some of you might know, was a disease that afflicted seamen and was the result of a lack of vitamin C, given that their diet consisted of water, rum, and dried biscuits. As Britain expanded its imperial and commercial networks across the world in the 18th century, there was therefore an increasing need to protect sailors from this disease. And there were various theories that developed as to what might be an effective cure or treatment for it. Of course, today we know that if they had just drunk a little bit more orange juice, it would have been fine, as it's caused by lack of vitamin C. But this knowledge took a while to develop. This particular book was written by a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh named James Lind. And this is significant because Edinburgh in Scotland was an important centre for Enlightenment medicine. And indeed, most of the early medical schools in the United States were founded by Americans who'd studied in Edinburgh. We continue with the history of architecture and move into the 18th century, a period characterized by the so-called neoclassical style, which developed out of the Renaissance style of architecture. Here we have a very important book in the history of architecture, namely a collection of buildings and descriptions of them by the Italian architect Andrea Palladio, printed in Vicenza in the auspicious year of 1776. We also have, as part of this title page, an image of Palladio himself, suitably decked out in this sort of classical frame, with the image of him being somewhat reminiscent of a Roman coin as well. The most interesting feature of this book is the detailed and technically accurate drawings of both the inside and the outside of Palladio's various buildings. In other words, this book was a very useful tool for architects in England, France, and elsewhere who wanted to copy his buildings, which they did in large numbers. Indeed, many of the famous aristocratic houses you can now visit in the UK had as their models buildings by Palladio in Italy. Here we see the facade of a Palladian building with two stories, each separated by initially Ionic on the first floor and then Corinthian columns on the top. You'll also see the various technical specifications that have been set out for this building, including for the tops of the columns. This, in other words, was a highly useful as well as beautiful diagram of the facade of a Palladian villa, or perhaps palace. This figure shows us that Palladio gave instructions not only for the external facades of buildings, but also for the insides. Here you see both the ground floor and the upper floor rooms with their various columns, again Ionic. And you also are given quite explicit instructions about the proportions of the various parts of the decoration, as well as of the heights of the rooms and the general width of the building as well. We also have this very famous portico design, which is very typical of Palladian and Neo-Palladian architecture. It is essentially based on the design of a Roman temple from the early imperial period, but was reworked for an 18th century audience. You will no doubt recognize this design from several buildings in Britain, Hong Kong, and elsewhere. Here we have another important part of the collection, an account of the famous Macartney embassy to China, printed in 1798. The point of this embassy, from the British perspective, was to gain greater access to Chinese markets, and perhaps even to set up a trading post on some island. The Chinese side, however, treated the British embassy as a tributary mission, and the gifts that they brought as tribute. There were also long debates about ritual, with the British being very unwilling to kowtow to the emperor, as this was not the convention with the British monarch. Of interest to us is the fact that Macartney brought with him various artists, architects, and cartographers, and so the mission produced a large number of detailed maps and images of important Chinese geographical and architectural buildings. Let's have a look, shall we? The book opens with this very detailed world map, which shows the route that they took from Britain to Guangdong, and there on land to Beijing. You can see by the late 18th century, map-making techniques had advanced significantly in Europe, to the point where the map that you see here is recognizable to us today. We also have various other images of the coast of Guangdong, and very detailed maps for navigating around the various islands that are a large hazard to ships sailing between Europe and China. We then have more detailed drawings of the various Chinese provinces, and also notes of the route that they took. Here we have one of the most famous images from this book, that of the Great Wall, one of the most detailed Western images of it to date. This greatly impressed the British, who wrote at great length about the wall, its construction, and its effectiveness. This information was later used during the wars of the 19th century. We also have this wonderful view of the gardens of the Imperial Palace in Beijing. You get, I sense, a feel for its wealth and the surprise of the British when they finally got there. Our final book is a 1743 edition of Shakespeare's plays, which already by the 18th century were considered a classic. You see here on the title page that this edition was printed in Oxford. And in fact, here you have the skyline of that city that you may recognize, with the Sheldonian Theatre and various colleges and so forth. Here we have the bard himself, along with representations of his art, and the title, The Works of Shakespeare in 6 volumes. Many of you will have heard of A Midsummer Night's Dream, of which they made a movie. And here you have the various characters set out in a list. And you have the beginning of the play itself. Act 1, Scene 1. And a nice engraving here describing the events of Act 3, Scene 2. For those of you who have read Shakespeare in school or elsewhere, you will recognize the layout of the play. You'll notice the difference between italics and the standard upright characters, and you'll also notice the stage instructions, which are the same ones we use today. So exit, for instance. And here again, exit at the end of Scene 3 as it goes into Scene 4.